I live in my car, drive a taxi at night, have no past, only one habit. Whenever I'm stressed, my fingers unconsciously tap on the steering wheel, 3 quick taps, then a longer, slower one. That night, I picked up a passenger, and he sat in the front seat. The whole journey, he didn't take his eyes off my hands. When the tapping stopped, he froze. This rhythm. My father used to do it, he whispered. Then he looked straight at me. He disappeared 15 years ago, and from that moment I understood everything was about to change. Your presence from the beginning is something I greatly appreciate, thank you. Now I'm curious, what city or country are you from? Please let me know in the comments, as your input helps us know how far the story will spread. Also, please note, this story contains some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message I want to convey is helpful. The rain started the way it always does in Houston, quietly, almost politely, like it was apologizing for what came next. It was close to 11 on a Thursday night in September 2024, and the streets downtown were slick and dark, the kind of wet that made the traffic lights bleed color across the asphalt. I had the windows cracked just enough to let in the smell of it, that particular mix of rain and concrete, and something faintly electric that only cities carry when a storm is building offshore. Most people smelled that and went inside. I rolled it down another inch. My name is Thorn. That's the only name I use, the only one that matters anymore. No last name. No origin story. Just Thorn, a word that fits like a jacket you've had so long you forget what you looked like before you owned it. 15 years I'd been answering to it. 15 years since the name I was born with went into the ground, along with everything else I used to be. The Lincoln Town car was old, a 2003 black, with a cracked leather seat I'd patched twice with electrical tape, and a heater that worked about 70% of the time. She wasn't pretty, but she ran. I'd bought her for $2,200 cash from a lot on the south side of town. By then I had a name not my own, but one that worked on paper. A shelter counselor in Beaumont back in the first year after the hospital had helped me navigate the state's process for issuing ID to people with no prior documentation. It took time. Most things worth having do. The car came after the ID. The dispatch license came after the car. More importantly, she didn't ask questions. In my line of work, that counted for a lot. I turned south onto Milam Street. No particular reason, just letting the car breathe. This was the rhythm of my night's slow loops through downtown, the theater district. The edge of Midtown, where the new high-rises were still going up, and the construction lights burned orange through the dark. I'd learned every turn by feel, every pothole, every stretch of road that flooded first when the rain came hard. Houston had become the only geography I knew, and I'd memorized it the way some men memorize scripture, not because I chose to, but because I needed something solid to hold on to. The headache was already there. Low and dull, sitting just behind my left eye, the way it always did by the end of a long shift. I'd stopped fighting it years ago. The medication helped when I could afford it, but the past 2 weeks had been thin on fares and thinner on sleep, and I'd rationed the last of my pills 4 days ago. Now I just drove through it, let it sit there. Let my mind go somewhere quieter until it backed off enough to function. At a red light on Texas Avenue, my fingers moved before I told them to. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. 3 short, 1 long. I'd been doing it as long as I could remember, which I'll admit wasn't saying much. But even in the early days, when I was still piecing together who I was from scraps and guesses, that rhythm was already there. On the steering wheel, on the edge of a diner counter, on my own knee in the dark. My dispatcher at the time, a big guy named Roy, had asked me about it once. I told him it was just something I did to concentrate. He'd shrugged and gone back to his coffee. Some habits don't need explaining. They just exist, the same way certain scars exist. You stop asking how you got them and start just getting used to them being there. The light changed. I moved through the intersection. That's when I saw it the way I always saw it when I came through this part of downtown. The Sterling Tower. 62 floors of glass and steel rising above the Houston skyline, lit from the inside, so that even on a rainy night it seemed to glow. One of the tallest buildings in the city, one of the most photographed. Every architecture magazine had run it at least twice. I knew that without knowing how I knew it. I hated the way it made me feel. Not anger. Not sadness exactly. Something older than both of those. Something that lived in my chest just below the ribs and pulled tight every single time that building came into view. Like recognizing a song you can't name. Like looking at a photograph of a place you've never been, but somehow already know the smell of. My right hand drifted off the wheel. I didn't notice it at first, but at the next stop sign, I caught myself my index finger tracing something against the fogged glass of the side window. Lines. Curves. A particular angle repeated twice. I pulled my hand back and pressed it flat against my thigh. This happened sometimes. I could never explain it. The headache spiked, just once sharp and clean behind the eye, then settled back to its usual dull insistence. I exhaled and kept driving. The radio was on low, a Houston AM station that ran news through the night. I barely listened most of the time, just kept it on for the company. But a phrase cut through the static clearly enough to make me turn up the volume without thinking. Marking 15 years since the founding of Sterling Group, one of Houston's most powerful development empires, built as the story goes. From a single revolutionary architectural design that changed the city's skyline forever. The anniversary gala is set for January, and the Sterling family is expected to. I turned it off. The cab went quiet except for the rain and the wipers and the low hum of the engine. I sat with that silence for a moment, one hand on the wheel, the other still pressed flat against my leg. I didn't know why I'd turned it off. I didn't know why my jaw was tight, or why there was something sitting at the base of my throat that felt uncomfortably close to nausea. I hadn't heard anything upsetting. Just a news item. Just a name. Just a name. My phone buzzed on the dash mount. New ride request, Grand Hyatt Regency downtown. VIP pickup. High tip flagged. I stared at the screen for 3 full seconds. Then I accepted it, pulled back onto the street, and told myself it was just another fare. The rain was coming harder now, harder than the forecast had called for. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in a place I'd spent 15 years learning not to look, something shifted. Something small and old and very quiet, like a door barely beginning to open. By the time I pulled into the Grand Hyatt's valet circle, the rain had stopped apologizing. It came down in sheets, now turning headlights into halos and making the streets run like shallow rivers between the curbs. The hotel entrance was bright and warm through the downpour. Gold light past the glass doors, black sedans lined up under the covered drop-off. My Lincoln fit in about as well as a work boot at a black-tie dinner. I pulled up anyway. The valet attendants were swamped. Umbrellas everywhere. A line of guests stretched under the awning phones, raised faces tight with the frustration of people who considered inconvenience a personal offense. I checked my phone. VIP tag pre-booked. 2 passengers. River Oaks. They came out together, but not the way people come out together when they're comfortable with each other. The older one led mid-50s, the kind money maintains well. Dark suit, no tie, a phone pressed to his ear before he'd cleared the revolving door. He moved through the crowd, the way men move when they've never once considered they might be in anyone's way. He folded into the back seat without looking at me. Door barely closed before he was talking again. Tell Edward the permits need to be filed by Thursday. Not Friday. Thursday. I noted the name the way you note weather. I'd heard 1,000 versions of that conversation. The younger one was different. He came through 3 steps behind hands in his jacket pockets. Collar turned up against rain he was already sheltered from. Same bone structure as the older man brothers, clearly. But where the first moved, like he owned the room, this one moved like he was cataloging it. He glanced at the Lincoln, then at me through the windshield, and something in his expression settled into a decision. He opened the front passenger door and got in. VIP clients didn't sit up front. It wasn't a written rule, just the unspoken arrangement everyone maintained. But he pulled the door shut and looked straight ahead, like he'd made the most natural choice in the world. I didn't ask. I put the car in drive. We moved on to the street wipers, working hard, radio off. In the back, Vance kept talking directives, timelines, the ambient sound of late-night Houston money. The younger one said nothing, just watched the city go dark and wet outside his window. Louisiana Street then left toward Westheimer. At the first red light, without thinking the way I never thought about it, my fingers found their rhythm on the wheel. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. The light held. Rain drummed on the roof. That's when I noticed the shift. The man beside me, who had been still the way a person is still when they're deliberately holding themselves together, became a different kind of still. Rigid, like something had reached into his chest and pulled. In my peripheral vision, I saw his head turn slow, like he was fighting the impulse toward my hands on the wheel. The light changed. I drove. At the next stretch, a gap in the clouds let a blade of streetlight fall across my left hand at the bottom of the wheel. The man beside me had gone completely silent in a way that was different from quiet. His breathing had changed slower, more controlled, the kind a person takes when they're trying not to react to something. Then I caught his eyes in the rearview mirror. He was looking directly into it. Not at the road, not at the rain, at me. The expression on his face was something I couldn't place. Not recognition exactly. Something that lived underneath recognition, older, heavier, the kind of look that belongs to grief, that's had years to settle into a person's bones. I held his gaze half a second, then looked back at the road. Nobody said a word for the rest of the drive. midnight, River Oaks. Vance was out before the car fully stopped still on his phone, moving toward a building that gleamed like it had never once seen bad weather. He didn't look back. Julian, I didn't know his name yet, but that's who he was, opened his door slowly. Didn't get out immediately. Sat with one hand on the door handle, looking straight ahead through the rain. Then quietly, almost under the sound of it, that rhythm. He didn't look at me. My father used to do that. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. He turned and looked at me directly. Not the way passengers look at drivers, but the way a person looks at something they've spent a long time searching for, and aren't certain yet they've found. He disappeared 15 years ago, he said. Then he got out, set a slim brown leather wallet on the passenger seat. Closed the door without another word. The wallet sat there square and deliberate against the worn upholstery. My hand moved toward the horn, but when I looked up, he was already through the door, the glass closing behind him without a sound. I set the wallet on the dashboard and sat there in the rain. In 15 years, I'd found phones, watches, a passport, a child's shoe, the inexplicable debris of other people's lives. I always called it in. Always. But I sat there looking at that wallet, and I understood before I had the words for it that whatever he'd said in the rain, whatever those 15 years meant to a man who looked at a stranger the way he'd looked at me, the life I'd been living was about to become something else entirely. The morning after a Houston storm has a particular quality to it. The city washed pale, the air thinned out, everything just a little more exposed than usual in the weak early light. I'd been coming to May's Diner for going on 4 years. It wasn't much a narrow storefront on the east side of downtown 8 Tables Coffee that came in mugs the size of soup bowls, and a woman named May, who'd stopped asking for my order about 3 years ago and just started bringing it. Corner booth black coffee, 2 eggs, scrambled wheat toast, every morning after a night shift. It was the closest thing I had to a ritual, which meant it was the closest thing I had to a home. I was halfway through the eggs when he walked in. I recognized him, before he reached the table, the same measured way of moving jacket, different from the night before but the same quality of fabric, the same habit of scanning a room before committing to entering it fully. He spotted me, crossed the diner without hesitation, and set the brown wallet on the table between us. "You left before I could call you back," I said. "I know." He pulled out the chair and sat down. No apology for the intrusion, just sat like he'd been expected. "How'd you find this place?" "Your dispatch log lists this address as your regular morning stop." It wasn't difficult. I should have been bothered by that. I wasn't entirely, and I wasn't sure what that said about me. He raised 2 fingers toward May without turning around. She brought 2 coffees without being asked. I watched that happen, and filed it away, the ease of a man accustomed to being understood in rooms where people moved around him rather than the other way around. "How long have you been driving?" he asked. "Long enough." "In Houston, specifically?" 6 years, give or take." He nodded like that confirmed something. "And before Houston, different places, people move around." He didn't push. Most people pushed when you gave them nothing, filled the silence with more questions, got uncomfortable. He just let the answer sit. That kind of patience is either learned or it's grief. Sometimes it's both. After a moment, "Do the headaches still come at night?" I set the mug down. I don't remember mentioning headaches." "You had the window cracked in a rainstorm. Radio low even when the road noise was loud. Left hand on the wheel more than your right." He paused. "Those are things people do when their head hurts and they're managing it. You notice a lot." "Habit," he said. "Professional liability." I didn't ask what his profession was. He didn't offer it. At some point, my fingers found the table. The rhythm came out of nowhere the way it always did, barely audible under the diner noise. I wasn't aware of it until I caught the shift in him. Not a flinch. More like a man bracing against something he'd been half expecting and still wasn't ready for. His head turned slightly toward the window. His jaw tightened once and released. I stopped. "Sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. "Don't be." His voice was even, too even, the way a voice gets when someone is working to keep it that way. His phone lit up on the table. He reached for it reflexively, and for just a half second before his palm covered the screen, I caught the wallpaper, a photograph. Color faded the way images get when they've been saved too many times. A family, somewhere bright. I couldn't make out any faces before the screen went dark under his hand. He left it face down after that. We talked for another 20 minutes, careful questions, careful answers, nothing that meant much on the surface. He didn't explain the wallet or the front seat, or why a man like him was drinking diner coffee on a Thursday morning in the East End of Houston, and I didn't ask. When he stood to leave, something changed in the air, the way pressure drops before weather moves in. He buttoned his jacket, picked up his phone, then stopped. He stood with his hand on the back of the chair, looking at something past my shoulder. Then he looked at me. "Have you ever felt like you belong somewhere you can't remember?" I sat with that for a beat. "Every day," I said. It was the most honest thing I'd said to another person in 15 years. I wasn't sure why I said it to him. He held my gaze one long second, then nodded once and walked out without looking back. I sat with my coffee going cold. My fingers were still moving against the table. The same rhythm. Always the same. That evening on my usual route through downtown, I found myself slowing without meaning to. The Sterling Tower rose against the darkening sky, lit from within, the way it always was. 1,000 times I'd passed it. I knew the toll it charged, the hollow pull, the nausea, the headache arriving right on schedule. But tonight, there was none of that. Instead, something I hadn't felt in a very long time was working its way up through my chest, quiet and insistent, like an ember that had spent years waiting for someone to lean down and breathe on it. I didn't have a name for it yet, but it was there. 3 days of driving the same streets, the same loops, the same late-night radio, and the question Julian had left on the table followed me through all of it. Have you ever felt like you belong somewhere you can't remember? I told myself it was nothing. A strange man, a strange line of questioning. I told myself that on day 1 and day 2, and I was still telling myself on day 3 when I pushed open May's door and saw him already there. Corner booth. My corner booth. 2 mugs of coffee, one on each side. May caught my eye from behind the counter and gave a small shrug. I crossed the diner and sat down. Picked up the mug on my side without a word. Some part of me had known he'd come back. I wasn't sure what to do with that. "You're not working for Sterling Group," I said. "No." "But you're a Sterling." "By blood." He turned the mug in his hands. "Not by choice, exactly." He said it like there was a long story behind it. He didn't offer it, and I didn't ask. Julian Sterling operated on a need-to-know basis, and he decided what counted as need. "You're an architect," I said. He glanced at me. "Independent. Restoration work, mostly. Why?" "You watched the valet circle at the Grand Hyatt like you were reading blueprints, and you looked at the ceiling when you walked in just now. First thing. Most people look at the tables." Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, more like quiet confirmation. "Old habit," he said. "Occupational." I understood that answer more than I wanted to. He set his mug down and looked at me directly. "The hospital where they treated you. Memorial Hermann. I told you that. John Doe admission, no ID, no registration. Blunt force head trauma, 2 broken ribs, laceration on the inner left forearm." He said it the way a person recites something they've read many times. "Unconscious for 11 days. Medical records aren't public." "No," he agreed without explaining further. "I've been looking a long time. I know how to find things." I believed him. He took out his phone, unlocked it, set it face up on the table, and slid it across. The photograph was older color, softened the way images get when they've been saved across too many devices. A man in his mid-40s, dark jacket, no tie, leaning over a drafting table covered in architectural drawings. Left hand flat on the surface, fingers spread. Head slightly bowed. Concentrating, I looked at it. Something happened in my chest I didn't have a name for. Not recognition, I couldn't call it that with any certainty. More like a word sitting on the tip of your tongue that won't come. The shape of something familiar pressing against a wall you can't see through. The way the man held his shoulders. The position of that hand. The headache came in from the left. "His name was Silas Sterling," Julian said. Quiet. Careful. "He disappeared 15 years ago. Found outside the city limits, no identification. He was an architect." A pause. "One of the best in the country, according to anyone who worked with him." I kept looking at the photograph. The tapping," he continued. 3 short, 1 long. His father taught it to him, a focus technique. My mother described it to me when I was 12. She said you could always hear it from the next room when he was working through something difficult. I became aware that my right hand was resting on the edge of the table, that my fingers were still, because I had stopped them. "The ring on your left hand," he said. plain gold band worn thin on the underside. The scar on the inner forearm about 3 centimeters irregular, consistent with broken glass. He looked up from my hand to my face. I saw both of them in the car that night when the streetlight came through the window. The silence between us was the loudest thing in the room. I looked down at my own hand. The ring, the scar just visible below my cuff. My fingers lying flat and motionless on the table like they'd been caught at something. I stood up. Pure reflex. 15 years of survival instinct moving my body before my mind had a vote. The chair scraped. I was on my feet. "You've got the wrong man." Julian didn't move, didn't stand, didn't reach, didn't raise his voice. He just looked up at me across the table with his coffee going cold between his hands. "Maybe," he said. "But I've been looking for 15 years. And I've never been this close before." I walked out. The Houston morning hit me wind off the bayou wet pavement, still drying a truck somewhere on the overpass. I stood on the sidewalk and breathed and looked for something steady inside myself. My hands were shaking. I didn't know if it was anger or fear or something, without a clean category, something that lived in the space between a man who'd built a life out of not knowing and the first serious threat to that arrangement in 15 years. Through the plate glass behind me, Julian was still in the booth, not looking at his phone, not looking around the diner, looking out through the glass. At me. He wasn't going to follow. He wasn't going to push. He was just going to wait. And standing there with my hands unsteady and the wind moving through the gap between buildings, I understood that Julian Sterling waiting was somehow harder to walk away from than if he'd come running after me. I didn't go back inside, but I didn't leave either. I stood there for a long time with something I couldn't name rattling around in my chest, and I didn't have anywhere else to be. I told myself I was going there to tell him to stop. That was the story I carried across town on a Thursday afternoon, through midtown traffic and 2 red lights and a stretch of road where the construction had narrowed everything down to a single lane. I was going to knock on the door, say what needed saying, and be done with it. I was not going to stand on another sidewalk unable to move in either direction. I was going to close this particular door and go back to driving. I believed that story right up until Julian opened the apartment door, and I walked inside without being asked twice. The space was clean in the way that working spaces get clean. Not decorated, not curated, but organized by a mind that knew exactly where everything was and why. Bookshelves on 2 walls, mostly architecture, the spines worn from use rather than display. A drafting table in the corner with a proper lamp angled over it. Pencils sorted in a ceramic cup by grade. The kind of apartment that belonged to someone who worked the way other people breathed constantly quietly without needing an audience. But it was the wall across from the window that stopped me. A corkboard roughly 4 feet across, covered edge to edge. Newspaper clippings, some of them yellowed at the margins. Photographs, some printed, some photocopied. A city map of Houston with small marks in 3 or 4 locations. Hospital documents with names redacted. A missing persons report, the kind that gets filed when someone has been gone long enough that hope is a smaller and smaller country. Strings of handwritten notes in the margins of things. Annotations layered over annotations, the record of a search conducted over years in the disciplined, patient way that only someone who genuinely believed they would find something could sustain. 15 years of looking for one man pinned to a wall in a midtown apartment. Julian didn't say anything. He stood back and let me look. It wasn't a search for me specifically. It couldn't have been 15 years ago. It was a search for a man who had disappeared in 2009, reconstructed from everything Julian could find that the official story didn't account for. The cab driver had been the latest thread, not the first. I moved along the board slowly. A face appeared in several of the photographs, mid-40s, Always working, always leaning into something, blueprints or models or the framing of a structure mid-construction. I didn't study the face directly. I wasn't ready for that. I let my eyes move past it and onto the documents, the dates, the timelines. Then I stopped. Near the center of the board, a newspaper spread the Houston Chronicle, the date worn off the corner, but the headline still clear. A photograph of a building I knew without having to look for it. 62 floors. Glass and steel. The particular vertical rhythm of its facade, the way the upper third set back at an angle that caught the afternoon light differently from the rest. I'd driven past it 1,000 times. I'd traced its outline on a fogged window without understanding why. The headache moved in fast, not the slow crawl of the usual kind, but something sharper arriving from the left side and pressing behind my eye like a thumb pushing against glass. I must have put a hand on the edge of the corkboard, because Julian was beside me a moment later, not touching, just present. "You should sit down," he said. "I'm fine." He didn't argue. He crossed to the drafting table and came back with a single sheet of white paper and a pencil which he set on the small table beside the armchair near the window. Then he looked at me. "Don't think about it," he said. "Just draw whatever comes. Whatever your hand wants to do." He held my gaze for one steady moment. "I'll make coffee." He went to the kitchen. I stood in the middle of the room and looked at the paper on the table, the pencil beside it. Outside the window, the midtown skyline was going amber in the late afternoon light. Somewhere below, a delivery truck was backing up with that particular beeping cadence that cities run on. I was going to leave the paper blank. That was my intention. Sit down, wait for the coffee, tell Julian this proved nothing, and go. I was very clear about this. I sat down. I picked up the pencil. I don't know how to explain what happened next in a way that makes sense from the outside. My hand moved. I was aware of it distantly. The way you're aware of your own heartbeat when you stop and pay attention, present the whole time, but usually below the threshold of notice. The pencil moved across the paper in lines that felt neither random nor chosen. I wasn't looking at anything. I wasn't trying to remember anything. I was just sitting in a chair in a quiet apartment while the afternoon light shifted, and my hand was doing something I had not asked it to do. When Julian came back from the kitchen, I was looking down at the paper on my lap with an expression I couldn't have described and didn't try to. He set one mug on the side table. He stood across from me and looked at what I was holding. He didn't speak immediately. He placed his mug down carefully without a sound, the way a person sets something down when they're managing how they're feeling and don't want to spill it. "Do you know what you drew?" he asked. "No," I said, which was true. He crossed to the corkboard and touched the newspaper photograph, the Sterling Tower full facade, the angle that caught afternoon light differently from every other building on the skyline. Then he turned and looked at the paper in my hands. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. I looked at the drawing, then at the photograph, the vertical lines, the setback in the upper third, the particular rhythm of the horizontal elements across the middle floors, a detail so specific it had been written about in 2 architecture journals, a signature embedded in the mathematics of the structure itself. I had drawn it. Freehand from nothing, from whatever lived below the part of my mind I had access to. My hands were in my lap. I was looking at them. The way you look at tools that have done something. You didn't authorize, not quite yours anymore. Not quite foreign, something in between, that didn't have a category. I stood up. I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that didn't require more than I had available right then. I moved toward the door. Behind me I heard Julian shift, heard him not follow, not call out. I stopped at the door. The paper was in my hand. I didn't set it down on the table by the door. I didn't leave it on the chair. My hand rolled it once loosely and tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket. I don't know why I did that. I only know I couldn't leave it behind. 2 days I drove around with that piece of paper in my jacket pocket. I didn't unfold it. Didn't need to. I could feel the shape of it against my chest. Every time I reached for my seatbelt, every time I climbed in or out of the Lincoln. Just paper. Just lines I'd drawn without meaning to. I told myself it didn't mean anything I hadn't already decided it meant. On the second evening, I drove to Midtown and knocked on Julian's door. He opened it, looked at me, and stepped aside without a word. I walked in. The apartment was the same drafting table, bookshelves, the corkboard wall I didn't look at directly. He waited. I want to drive through the city," I said. "I want to look at the buildings. I need you to come." He picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. We took the Lincoln. I drove and Julian rode passenger, same as the first night, except nothing about this felt like that first night. I went slower than usual, 15 miles an hour in a 30 zone, which in Houston will get you honked at inside of 40 seconds, and I didn't care. My eyes kept drifting upward, which is not something you do when you're driving, but I couldn't stop them. The city looked different. That's the only way I can explain it. The same streets I'd driven for 6 years, the same intersections and overpasses and glassed-in towers catching the late afternoon light, and all of it looked different. Not changed, but revealed, like a photograph, where someone has finally adjusted the contrast, and what was always there has simply become visible. I turned onto Smith Street and slowed further. There was a mid-rise on the left, maybe 20 floors, glass and concrete construction, the kind of building that gets called contemporary in real estate listings and ignored by everyone else. I looked at the top 3 floors, the way the glass panels stepped back at a slight inward angle, the shadow line it created at 4 in the afternoon. "The upper setback," I said. "It's 11 degrees. Not 10, not 12. 11. Julian looked at his phone. Something passed across his face. "Correct," he said. I kept driving. A civic building on the next block. A public library branch, older, brick-faced, not flashy. I looked at the entrance, the proportions of the 3 arched windows above the main doors. The window arches. The keystone is slightly elongated. It's not structural. Its visual makes the facade read taller than it is. Julian didn't check his phone that time. "Correct," he said, quieter. We went like that for 40 minutes, through downtown, through Midtown, along the edge of the theater district. Each time I said something, Julian confirmed it. Each time he confirmed it, something in my chest pulled a little tighter, the way a knot pulls when you find the right end of it. I wasn't drawing on knowledge I'd studied. I wasn't working from anything I could point to. The information was just there underneath the part of my mind I could access, rising up when I looked at the right things. It wasn't like remembering. It was like being remembered. Eventually, I turned south and drove to McKinney Street, and then I stopped the car. Sterling Tower rose in front of us, the full 62 floors, catching the last of the late afternoon sun on its upper face, while the street below had already gone into shade. I'd parked here before without meaning to. I'd driven past it 100 times. I had a whole history of looking at this building from inside a moving car and feeling something I couldn't afford to examine. I got out. The sidewalk was cool in the shadow of it. I stood on the concrete and looked up. Really looked the way I hadn't let myself before tracing the facade from the street-level plaza all the way up to the crown. The vertical rhythm of the curtain wall. The way the building's mass shifted at the 30th floor. The particular handling of the corner glass wrapped, rather than butted, so the reflections moved across the surface when you moved, rather than staying fixed. I knew this building, not the way you know a landmark, not the way you know something you've seen 1,000 times, the way you know something you made. Julian came and stood beside me on the sidewalk. Neither of us spoke for a moment. I reached into my jacket pocket, unfolded the paper, the drawing I'd made in his apartment 2 days ago, the lines I hadn't been able to leave behind. I held it up beside the building in front of us. I didn't need Julian to confirm anything. The lines matched the way a key matches its lock. Silas, I said. Julian looked at me. My name is Silas. I said it the way you say something out loud that you've been saying to yourself for days to see if it holds up. It was not a question. It was not an answer. It was just a sound I was making in the world, testing whether the shape of it fit the shape of me. It did. That was the part that frightened me. How many buildings? I asked. My voice came out lower than I intended. Julian looked up at the tower, then back at me. Enough to build an empire, he said. And not one of them carries your name. We stood there on the sidewalk and let that land. After a while, I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket. I walked to the car and got in. Julian got in on the other side. I sat with my hands on the wheel and the engine off for a long moment, looking at the base of the building through the windshield. Not processing, not deciding anything, just sitting with what I'd seen the way you sit with weight before you decide whether you can carry it. Then Julian's phone rang. No name on the screen. I caught a glimpse of it when he lifted the phone from his jacket. He answered. It said nothing for several seconds, and I watched his face change the way faces change when something cold moves through a person. Not panic. Something more controlled than panic, which was somehow worse to watch. He ended the call, put the phone in his pocket, looked at me. We need to leave, he said. Now. 15 years of driving late-night Houston had given me a reliable instinct for the difference between someone being dramatic and someone being serious. Julian Sterling had not once in all the time I'd known him been dramatic. I started the engine and pulled into traffic without asking a single question. The motel Julian chose was the kind of place that didn't ask for names beyond what was on the credit card, and where the parking lot lights had been half burned out long enough that nobody expected them to be fixed. 20 minutes west of downtown on I-10, tucked behind a gas station and a storage facility, the kind of establishment that existed specifically to be overlooked. Under different circumstances, I might have driven past it 100 times without registering it. We checked in without talking. Room 12. 2 double beds. A table bolted to the wall, a bathroom with a light that hummed. Julian set his bag on the nearest bed and sat in the chair by the window. I sat on the edge of the other bed and waited. Outside, a light rain had started, the fine, directionless kind that Houston sometimes produces in the last weeks of September, more atmosphere than weather. The call, I said. Julian nodded. He turned the phone over in his hands without looking at it. Someone inside the company. Someone who's been there a long time and has reasons of their own to be careful. He paused. Sir Vance has been asking questions. About a cab driver. Older man drives a black Lincoln seen with me twice in the past week. He's looking for me. He's looking for the man I've been spending time with. He doesn't know yet. Julian set the phone on the table. But he's moving. When Vance starts moving, things happen fast. I sat with that. Outside the window, the rain tapped lightly against the glass, patient and persistent. He wants you out of the city tonight, Julian said. I have a contact in Austin, someone we can trust. It's 3 hours. You'd be safe. No. Julian looked at me. I've been living like a shadow for 15 years, I said. The words came out level, which surprised me because the thing underneath them was not level at all. Not one more day, not one more hour. I looked at my hands. Whatever is coming, I'd rather meet it standing up than spend another 15 years looking over my shoulder at it. Julian held my gaze for a moment. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, thick, well-organized. The kind of document set that someone has assembled and reassembled over years until the order of it becomes second nature. He spread it on the table between us. I moved to the chair across from him and sat down. Reading about yourself in someone else's handwriting is one of the stranger experiences available to a person. The intake report from Memorial Hermann. A police report filed and closed without resolution. A missing persons record opened in October 2009, last updated 4 years later, with a note that said no new leads, case remains open. Photographs of the man from the corkboard now printed larger in better light. The same face I'd been avoiding looking at directly since the first time Julian showed it to me. I looked at it now. The angle of the jaw, the way the brow settled when concentrating. The left hand, always the left hand, resting flat on whatever surface was nearest table, blueprint, windowsill. I didn't say anything. Julian didn't say anything. We sat in the quiet of the room and let the file be what it was. After a while, I reached across the table and picked up one of Julian's pencils from the side of the folder where he'd set them. He watched me but didn't speak. I pulled a blank sheet toward me. This time I wasn't in someone else's apartment. There was no expectation in the room, no experiment being conducted. I was in a motel room outside Houston at 11 at night, with rain on the window and a folder full of my own history open in front of me. And I wanted to know with full awareness, with my eyes open, what my hands would do. I started at the top left corner of the page and worked inward. Not the facade, not the exterior elevation I'd produced the first time, the lines that had come out of me like something released under pressure. Something else. The interior. A cross-section floor plate, structural core, the spatial logic of how the building moved light from the exterior curtain wall down into the central atrium. The mechanical systems layered between the floors, how they were routed to keep the primary column lines clean. Details that don't appear in architectural photography. Details that don't appear in permit filings. Details that live only in the working drawings, in the engineer's notes, in the mind of the person who originally solved the problem of how to make them function. I drew for 30 minutes without stopping. When I set the pencil down, Julian was leaning slightly forward, elbows on the table, looking at each line with the careful attention of someone reading a document in a language they'd been studying for a very long time. My hands never forgot, I said quietly, what my head lost. Julian sat back. He didn't speak immediately. The rain outside had softened further, barely audible now against the window. These details, he said finally. The mechanical routing, the core configuration. Vance filed the patents in 2010. He looked at me steadily. He removed this level of the drawings from the public record. The patent filings show the exterior and the structural shell. Nothing here. He touched the edge of my drawing without covering it. Nothing at this level of the interior system. No one outside the original design process would have access to this. I looked at the drawing, then up at him. Then we need someone who was there, I said. Someone who was in the room when the original design was developed. Someone who knows what happened and what was taken. I paused. There has to be someone like that. Julian said nothing, but something moved behind his eyes, recognition, and underneath it, something more complicated. He knew who I meant, or at least the shape of who I meant. He wasn't ready to say the name yet. Neither was I. I was about to say something else when the light changed. Through the gap in the curtain, the narrow vertical strip where the fabric didn't quite meet the wall, a wash of white light moved across the parking lot outside. Slow, deliberate. The kind of arc a car makes when it's not driving through, but circling. It passed across the window, held for a moment on the wall above the table where we sat, and then went dark. I didn't move. Julian didn't move. We both looked at the curtain for 3 full seconds. I reached over and picked up the drawing, folded it once, twice, and put it in my jacket pocket alongside the other one. We have until morning, I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. Julian nodded slowly, his eyes still on the curtain. Neither of us said anything after that, because we both understood, without needing to confirm it, that morning was not very far away. We left the motel before 6. Julian had been awake when I opened my eyes, sitting at the table by the window with the curtain pulled back an inch, watching the parking lot in the gray pre-dawn light. The car that had circled the lot the night before was gone. No way to know what that meant. We didn't discuss it. We packed what little we had, and were on I-10 heading east, before the first real light broke over the city. He made a call from the passenger seat while I drove. Short, quiet, professional. By the time we reached Greenway Plaza, someone was already waiting to unlock the building. Dr. Patricia Hartwell's office occupied the top floor of a converted townhouse on the quieter end of the plaza. The kind of address that announced competence without announcing itself. The frosted glass on the door read, Hartwell Architectural Consulting, and below that, in smaller type, Expert Analysis, Historic Preservation, Legal Documentation. Inside the space was all clean lines and morning light high ceilings, drafting surfaces, reference libraries, organized by decade. The kind of workspace that belonged to someone who thought in systems and had been doing it long enough to stop being impressed by complexity. Dr. Hartwell herself was somewhere in her mid-60s, silver-haired compact, the kind of still that comes from decades of concentration. She shook Julian's hand, then mine without questions, and indicated the large examination table in the center of the room. Julian unfolded the portfolio he'd assembled overnight, the drawings from the motel, the pages from his apartment, and then something I hadn't expected, a separate envelope which he opened to reveal a collection of smaller drawings on miscellaneous paper. Napkins. The back of a receipt, a torn corner of brown paper bag, all of them bearing the same hand, the same lines, the same architectural logic rendered in whatever was available at the moment. "How long have you had those?" I asked. "I don't know how long," Julian said without looking up from laying them out. May collected most of these. After our first conversation at the diner, she started setting aside what you left behind, napkins, receipts, whatever had marks on it. She didn't know what they were. She just knew they weren't nothing. He paused. "You've been drawing for years without knowing it." I didn't respond to that. I sat down in the chair near the window and looked out at the plaza below while Dr. Hartwell began her examination. The next 55 minutes were the quietest of my recent memory. Dr. Hartwell worked without commentary, moving between drawings with a loop, making notes in a small leather journal, cross-referencing against documents she pulled from her own files. Julian stood near the table and watched without interfering. I watched the plaza. At some point during the wait, my mind went back to the parking lot. The slow arc of headlights, the deliberate pace. I'd spent 15 years developing the instincts of someone who needed to know when they were being watched, and everything about that car had felt like surveillance rather than transit, which meant that whoever was looking had found us faster than Julian's contact had anticipated, which meant we were not working with as much time as we'd assumed. I was still thinking about that when Dr. Hartwell set her loupe down on the table and removed her reading glasses. She looked at the drawings for a moment longer, the way you look at something when you want your last impression to be accurate. Then she looked at me. "The drawings are internally consistent across all samples," she said. "Same hand, same spatial reasoning, same approach to technical problem solving. That's not unusual on its own." She picked up one of the motel pages, the cross-section, the interior mechanical system. "What is unusual is this. These specifications were never published. The patent filings for the Zenith, which I've reviewed as part of prior litigation work in this city, show the exterior envelope and the primary structural system. Nothing at the level of interior mechanical integration that appears here." She set the page down. "The person who drew these didn't study this design. They originated it. That's a meaningful distinction, and it would be a meaningful distinction in court." The room was very quiet after that. I stood up, crossed to the table, and extended my hand. Dr. Hartwell shook it firm, direct, no ceremony. "That's all I needed to hear," I said. She nodded once, She didn't ask for explanations, and I didn't offer any. Some transactions are cleaner without the surrounding context, and she seemed like someone who understood that. Julian thanked her and gathered the drawings. We were on the sidewalk outside within 10 minutes. The morning traffic on Edlow Street moving past us in both directions. The city going about its business as if nothing particular was happening. Julian looked at me. What now? I stood on the pavement for a moment, looked south toward the skyline, the upper floors of the taller buildings visible above the mid-rise line of the plaza. The particular one among them I didn't need to name anymore. The night of the storm, I said. The man in the back seat, he was on the phone the whole ride. I watched a cab move through the intersection. He said a name. I didn't think about it at the time. I heard it the way you hear background noise without filing it, but I've been hearing it since. Julian went still. Edward, I said. A pause. Edward Holt. Julian said carefully. He's been executive vice president of Sterling Group for 12 years. He was there at the founding. He stopped. He was there at the beginning of everything. I nodded slowly. Then he was in the room. He's not someone who talks easily, Julian said. He's protected himself for years. Whatever he knows, he's kept it under a great deal of careful silence. I turned and walked toward the car. I'm not asking him to talk easily, I said. I'm asking him to tell the truth. There's a difference. Behind me, I heard Julian's footsteps on the pavement falling into pace without argument, without further question. That I was learning was how Julian Sterling operated when he'd run out of objections. A week is enough time to learn a man's habits. Edward Holt, 62 years old, executive vice president of Sterling Group for the past 12 years, before that senior design director, and before that, junior architect on a project that had changed the Houston skyline forever. Lunch on Tuesdays and Thursdays at Carver's, a restaurant in the financial district that had been operating in the same location for 19 years and understood that its clientele valued consistency above atmosphere. Corner table inside facing the door. Black coffee, no dessert, an hour and 10 minutes, then back to the Sterling Group offices 4 blocks north. A man of rigid habits. In my experience, rigid habits belong to one of 2 types of people. Those who have found something that works and see no reason to change it, and those who need the structure of routine to keep something else from breaking loose. After a week of watching Edward Holt move through his days, I had a working theory about which kind he was. Thursday, 12:15. I watched him settle into his corner table from across the street. Then I crossed, walked through Carver's front door, moved past the host stand before anyone could intercept me, and sat down in the chair across from him. He looked up from the menu. What happened to his face in the next 2 seconds was something I had not fully prepared for even after a week of preparation. The color left him. Not gradually, it went the way it goes when a person receives news that rearranges everything they thought was true. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His hand, which had been holding the menu, set it down on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a much larger motion. He looked at me the way a person looks at something they have spent a long time believing they would never have to see. I didn't speak. I'd learned on the streets of this city across 15 years of 2 in the morning conversations with strangers going places they'd rather not be going. That silence does more work than questions in the first moments of something important. I let him look. I let the recognition, or whatever it was, because I couldn't name it from the outside, move through him at its own pace. He recovered. It took approximately 4 seconds, which was fast for what had just happened to his face, and told me something about the kind of discipline he'd built over a long career. I don't know who you are. His voice was low, controlled. The voice of a man who had said difficult things in boardrooms for decades and knew how to keep the instrument steady. I reached into my jacket and placed the drawing on the table between us. The cross-section of the zenith, the interior mechanical system, the specifications that didn't exist in any public record. I set it down and left my hand flat on the table beside it and waited. He looked at the drawing. His hands found the edge of the table. I watched his knuckles register white against the cloth. "You need to leave," he said. Quiet. Urgent in the way that urgency gets when it has been compressed into something almost calm. "Not because I want you to. Because you are in danger sitting here. More danger than you know." "I've been in danger for 15 years without knowing it," I said. "Knowing changes things." He looked at me, really looked the way people look when they're trying to reconcile two versions of something that shouldn't be able to exist at the same time. I held his gaze and let him do it. The restaurant moved around us, quiet conversations at other tables, the sound of silverware, a server crossing the floor somewhere behind me, the ordinary texture of a Tuesday lunch in the financial district, proceeding as if nothing unusual was happening in the corner by the window. Edward Holt looked like a man carrying something very heavy in a room full of people who had no idea. I didn't know what he was carrying. I couldn't see inside it from where I sat. But I'd spent enough time reading people across a rearview mirror to know the difference between the weight of guilt and the weight of grief, and what I was looking at in his face was not simple. It was layered, something that had been accumulating for a long time under careful, deliberate pressure. It was not hostility. That much I was sure of. Beyond that, I couldn't say. He looked down at the drawing again. Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible the way a structure shifts before it shows any external sign of movement. He exhaled slow and controlled. "Give me 3 days," he said finally. His voice had dropped further, almost below the ambient noise of the room. 3 days to arrange certain things. After that, he stopped, started again. "After that, I will tell you everything I know." I stood up. I didn't extend my hand, and he didn't offer his. Some agreements don't need that particular punctuation. 3 days, I said. I picked up the drawing from the table, folded it once, and put it back in my pocket. Then I walked through the restaurant the way I'd come in, past the other tables, past the host stand out through the front door, into the Houston afternoon. The sun hit me after the dimness inside. Julian was on the sidewalk 20 feet from the entrance, hands in his pockets, watching the street. He turned when he heard the door. He looked at my face and didn't ask if it had gone well or badly. He just waited. "He knows something," I said. We fell into step toward the car without discussing it. Something large enough to drain the color out of a man like that just from looking at a face. I paused. Whatever he's been carrying it a long time. "Did he say what?" Julian asked quietly. "He asked for 3 days. Julian was quiet for a moment. We reached the car. I unlocked it, and we got in and sat for a moment without starting the engine. 3 days, Julian said. Not a question. 3 days, I confirmed. He nodded slowly, looking out through the windshield at the financial district moving past in both directions. The ordinary commerce of a city that didn't know what was sitting inside it. In the circumstances we were operating in, 3 days was an uncomfortably long time to wait for anything. But Edward Holt had said everything I know, and I had learned across 15 years of driving strangers through this city in the dark, that when a careful man uses a word like everything, he generally means it. Before I tell you what Edward said at that table in the corner, write a number in the comments right now. Any number. What he said to Silas wasn't just a confession. It was the key to a door that's been locked since 2009. If you've made it this far, you deserve to hear it all. Leave your number, I'll continue. And please note, what follows contains some potentially fictional situations constructed for storytelling purposes. If this isn't the process you're looking for, you can absolutely stop here, and that's perfectly fine. 3 days. I'd spent them the way I spend most things that require patience behind the wheel moving through the city. letting the familiar rhythm of the road keep the surface of my mind occupied while something deeper worked through what was coming. I didn't tell Julian much. There wasn't much to tell yet. We waited. On the fourth morning, I drove back to Carver's alone. Edward was already at the corner table when I arrived. No phone on the surface, no briefcase, no folder, no notepad, nothing between him and whatever was about to happen. He looked like a man who had decided to stop carrying luggage. I sat down across from him. The server came. We both said no. She left. Edward looked at me for a moment, the same careful look from 3 days ago, but with something different underneath it now. The shock had cleared. What remained was older and quieter, and I thought more honest. He began. September 2009, he said. His voice was level, the voice of someone who has rehearsed something so many times that the performance has worn away and only the words remain. The construction site. The Zenith was 2 weeks from certification. The final ownership documentation hadn't been filed. He paused. I didn't move. Vance wanted full attribution. Complete. His name on the patents, the design credits, the filings, all of it. He'd been building toward it for months, quietly, the way Vance builds toward everything. Edward's hands rested on the table, very still. Your father refused. He told Vance the design was his, that the attribution would reflect that, and that there was nothing further to discuss. I listened. I was on site that evening. I knew there was going to be a confrontation. I'd seen it coming for weeks. I tried to get there before it escalated. He stopped. I didn't get there in time. He looked down at the table for a moment, then back up. Vance pushed him from the upper platform. The edge of the site, there was no railing on the northeast corner, a violation that had been flagged and not corrected. He fell 12 feet onto the concrete foundation below. A pause. Vance believed he was dead. I kept my face still. I was going to go to the police, Edward said. That night, I had my phone in my hand. He stopped. Vance told me what would happen if I did. Not to me, to people I loved. His jaw tightened once, then released. I made a choice. I've lived with it every day since. The ambient noise of the restaurant moved around us, silverware, quiet voices, the ordinary texture of a Tuesday. None of it reached our table. He's kept you as a kind of punishment, Edward said. A living one. He found out you'd survived a John Doe no ID head trauma admitted to Memorial Hermann. He chose not to investigate further. He chose to let you exist the way you were. Edward looked at me with something that was not quite pity and not quite guilt, but contained elements of both. A man who built empires living without his own name. He found that satisfying, in the way Vance finds things satisfying. I heard that. Set it aside to deal with later. There was a second reason, Edward continued. More practical. If anyone ever challenged the patent, challenged the attribution, Vance needed a version of you that couldn't fight back. A Silas Sterling with no memory, no documentation, no standing could be produced at a useful moment and made to sign whatever transfer documents Vance needed. Clean the record legally, forever. He let that sit. The night of the storm, he said. He recognized you. Not in the car, he didn't look at you in the car. After. When he reviewed the hotel's security footage. He saw the driver. He saw... Edward paused. He made calls that night. I know because I received one. I said nothing for a long time. When I was ready, I asked the only question that mattered to me right then. Is there anything else I need to know? Edward looked down at the table. His hands, which had been still the entire time, moved slightly, a small adjustment. like a man shifting his weight before standing. He looked up. "Your wife?" he said. "She's alive." I did not speak. "She found out what Vance had done," Edward said. Each word came out with the particular effort of something that has been held down for a very long time. How she was going to go to the police. Vance moved first. He told everyone she'd had a breakdown grief losing both her husband and her son in the same year, that she'd been admitted to a private clinic in Switzerland for long-term care. He paused. She never left Houston. The restaurant was very quiet. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to stand. My body made that decision, and I followed it. I looked at Edward across the table. He looked back at me without flinching. "Where?" I said. One word. He understood. He said a name, an address. I repeated both of them once inside my head, the way you fix something in place when you can't afford to lose it, and did not write anything down. Then I looked at him one last time before I turned to leave. "I need you ready," I said, "to say all of this again, in front of a lawyer, on record, in front of whatever room needs to hear it." I held his gaze. All of it. Edward Holt nodded. It was slow. It was deliberate, and it had the particular quality of a gesture made by someone who has just set down something very heavy, not with relief exactly, but with the exhausted recognition that they should have put it down a long time ago. I walked out of Carver's into the Houston afternoon and kept walking. By the time I reached Julian's building, the afternoon had gone gray, and still in that particular way Houston gets in late October. The heat finally backing off the sky, flattening to a pale, textureless white. I'd called Julian from the street outside Carver's. He'd been waiting at the door when I arrived with Edward beside me. The three of us sat in Julian's apartment for the first time. Edward in the chair by the window. Julian at the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees. Me across the room, where I could see both of them. Edward told it again, the version I'd already heard, but fuller now with Julian in the room. And I watched my son's face while he listened. I noticed I'd used that word even just in my own mind. The word arrived before I could examine it. I set it aside and focused on what I could observe. Julian didn't move for the first several minutes. He listened the way people listen when the information is reorganizing something fundamental. Not shock exactly, because some part of him had known on some level that what he'd built his understanding around wasn't solid. But knowing a foundation is unstable, and watching it go are two separate experiences. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been loose between his knees, slowly closed into something that wasn't quite a fist. He was thinking about Vance. I could tell without being told. Edward explained the story Vance had constructed, the one that had held for 15 years, without serious challenge. Margaret Sterling overcome by grief, the loss of her husband, then the disappearance of her eldest son in the same terrible year. A fragile woman, Vance had told anyone who'd asked, who needed complete privacy and specialized care. A clinic in Switzerland, highly regarded, very discreet. She'd asked that no one visit. She'd asked that no one contact her directly. She was healing slowly, and she needed distance from everything Houston represented. It had worked because it fit. Margaret had never been a public figure. She'd moved through Houston's social world, at the edges present, but not prominent. The kind of woman whose absence could be explained without many questions. And in the circles Vance occupied a private European clinic for a grieving widow was not a suspicious story. It was a familiar one. The kind of arrangement that announced money and discretion simultaneously, which in that world was enough to close most lines of inquiry before they opened. "Why keep her here?" Julian asked. His voice was controlled but thin at the edges. If he wanted her contained, why not actually send her abroad? Edward's hands rested on his knees. Because moving her out of the country creates documentation. Passports, medical records, transfer agreements. Things that exist in multiple systems and can be found. He paused. And because Vance has operated in this state for 30 years, he trusts his infrastructure here. He trusts that his name closes doors that might otherwise stay open. A beat. Men who've had power for a very long time sometimes forget it has edges. Julian absorbed that without responding. "She's at a facility called Rosewood," Edward said. "Private. Western outskirts, about 25 minutes from downtown. She's registered as Eleanor Webb, room 24 East Wing." He looked at me. "Staff rotation at that wing changes at 7 in the morning. There's a window between 6:40 and 7 when coverage is thinnest." Julian was on his feet before Edward finished the sentence. "We go tonight." I stood as well, and then did something I hadn't planned and couldn't entirely explain. I crossed the room and put my hand on Julian's shoulder. Just my hand resting there. He went still. "Not tonight," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "If Vance has any indication, we know he'll move her. He's been careful for 15 years. One wrong step, and she disappears somewhere we can't find." I kept my hand where it was. We get one chance at this. One. Julian looked at me. Something moved across his face that I didn't try to read or name. He nodded once and sat back down. Before Edward left, he stopped at the door. I'd been watching him all evening, the way he'd carried himself through the telling, the measured quality of his voice, the particular stillness of a man navigating something he'd rehearsed emotionally but never executed. Now, with his hand on the door, something about the set of his shoulders was different from when he'd come in. "Why now?" I asked. "After 15 years. Why all of this now?" He didn't turn around. "Because I've been carrying it long enough," he said. He opened the door and went out. I watched the door close behind him. His footsteps moved down the hallway, steady and slow, heavier in sound than they'd been on the way in, but with something in the rhythm that hadn't been there before. Something that, if I'd had to name it, I might have called straight. That night I lay on the couch in Julian's living room and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep. I tried to find her in whatever passed for my memory, not the clinical facts I'd just been given, but something real. A face, a voice, a specific warmth or a particular smell, the way real memory carries texture that information doesn't. Margaret Sterling. My wife, a woman who had spent 15 years somewhere in this city, under a name that wasn't hers, in a room I'd driven within 5 miles of 100 times without knowing. There was nothing, not a fragment, not a shadow of a fragment. The space where she should have been was completely empty, the way a room is empty when it's been cleared rather than simply unused. Something had been there once. I couldn't reach it. But lying there in the dark, I noticed something new about that emptiness. In 15 years of living with it, it had always felt like open water, unstructured directional pulling at nothing in particular. Tonight it had edges. It had a shape. It had a name. And it hurt in a way that was entirely different from the headaches. Deeper, older, more specific. I lay there with it until the gray light came back through the windows, and morning found me still awake. We went in on a Wednesday morning, 6:45, when the November light was still low and pale over the western outskirts of the city. Julian drove. I sat in the passenger seat with the paperwork Edward had prepared in a manila folder on my lap, visitation authorization. Identification matching the names he'd registered with the facility 2 days prior. The kind of documentation that exists to pass a front desk rather than survive scrutiny. We'd gone over it the night before. We knew what to say, and more importantly, what not to say. Rosewood looked from the road like a property someone had decided should feel expensive enough that no one would ask uncomfortable questions about it. Low iron fencing, decorative rather than functional. Manicured grounds with mature oaks and beds of late-season flowers that had been planted to suggest permanence and care. A main building in pale brick, 2 stories wide, windows catching the morning light. The parking area was quiet at this hour, a handful of staff vehicles, nothing else. It looked like the kind of place wealthy families sent people when they needed those people to disappear in a way that didn't look like disappearing. We checked in at the front desk without incident. The woman behind the counter reviewed the authorization, typed something into her system, and asked us to wait. 4 minutes later, a staff member in pale blue scrubs appeared and indicated we should follow. I watched the building as we moved through it. The public-facing areas, lobby, visiting room, the corridor leading to the east wing maintained the aesthetic of the exterior. Soft lighting, framed landscape prints, furniture that suggested comfort. But the doors were solid core, and every one of them was locked. The cameras were placed at every junction, angled to cover the maximum field without overlap. The staff moved with the particular economy of people who had been trained to be present without being noticeable. It was a very well-appointed place to have no choices. I thought briefly of the Lincoln, of 6 years of all-night shifts and bad coffee and the freedom to point the car in any direction and simply drive. It had not felt like freedom most of those years. It felt like it now by comparison. We stopped at a door on the east corridor. The staff member produced a key card, held it to the reader, and pushed the door open. She stepped back without a word, the way staff do when they've been instructed to give families privacy. Julian looked at me. I looked at the open doorway. I went in first. The room was larger than I'd expected, a sitting area near the window, a narrow bed against the inner wall, a writing desk with nothing on it. The window faced east, catching the full run of the morning light, and it was good light, the kind that falls cleanly without glare. She was sitting in a chair by the window. Her back was to us when we entered, and she didn't turn. Immediately, she'd likely learned in 15 years of this room not to react to sounds at the door with any particular speed. Her hair was white, fully white, cut simply to the shoulder. She sat with her spine straight and her hands in her lap, the posture of someone who had refused to let a decade and a half of confinement take that from her. I stood in the middle of the room and looked at her. I looked for something, some signal from somewhere below the level of thought, the kind of wordless recognition that people describe when they talk about blood and memory and the things the body supposedly knows without being told. I looked for a flicker, a pull, anything that would organize the moment into something I could hold. There was nothing. The woman in the chair by the window was a stranger, white-haired, upright, sitting in morning light in a room she hadn't chosen, entirely unknown to me. Whatever had lived between us once, whatever weight the word mother might have carried when I'd had access to the life that word belonged to, was on the other side of a wall I couldn't reach through. I stood there and felt the absence of it like a specific shape, the way you feel the outline of something missing from a shelf where it used to sit. Julian moved past me. "Mom?" he said, just that. Quiet the way you say something when you've been waiting a long time to say it, and the moment is finally here, and you don't trust yourself to say anything more. She turned. I watched her face when she saw Julian, the way a particular kind of emotion moves through someone who has learned through necessity to keep it contained. It came up fast and large, and she held it down, held it in the way you hold something in when you've taught yourself over years that letting it out in full is more than you can manage in the moment. Her eyes filled. She didn't let them spill. She pressed her lips together once, and then she stood, and Julian crossed the remaining distance between them. And then her eyes moved, past Julian's shoulder. To me. She stopped. Not the way people stop when they're surprised, or when they see something unexpected more fundamental than that. The way a clock stops. The way breathing stops for the half-second between one thing and whatever comes after it. She looked at me from across the room with an expression I couldn't read, from the outside couldn't translate into language, couldn't map onto any of the categories I'd developed over 15 years of watching strangers' faces in a rearview mirror. I didn't know what she saw when she looked at me. I only knew what I saw when I looked at her, a stranger's face in a room full of morning light, looking at me as though I were the answer to something she had stopped letting herself ask. My feet didn't move. Beside me, I heard Julian's breath change, a small, involuntary hitch, and then his shoulders moved in the way shoulders move when something releases that has been held too long. He didn't make a sound. He didn't need to. I stood where I was, hands at my sides in a room I had never been in, looking at a woman I did not remember, who was looking back at me like I was the thing she had spent 15 years not daring to believe in anymore. I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know what to do with any of it. So I stood there and I let it be what it was, and I waited to find out what would happen next. She stood, not quickly, carefully, the way someone moves, when they've learned that the world doesn't hold still for feeling, and that the only way to stay upright through it is to move slowly enough to keep your balance. She crossed the room toward me. I didn't step back. I didn't step forward. I stood where I was and let her come. She stopped in front of me. Up close, I could see what 15 years in a room like this had done, and what it hadn't. The white hair, the lines around her eyes, those it had done. But the way she held herself, the quality of stillness in her face, the particular steadiness in her gaze, those it hadn't touched. Whatever Vance had intended when he put her here, he hadn't managed to take that. She raised her hand. It was a thin hand, thinner than I would have expected, the skin fine over the bones, the way hands get, when they've had less to do than they were built for. She raised it slowly and placed it against my face, her palm against my jaw, her fingers at my temple. Her eyes moved down to my left hand, to the plain gold band worn thin on the underside, then to the cuff of my sleeve and what lay beneath it. She looked at both of those things for a long moment. Then she looked back at my face, and whatever she had been searching for, she found. I stood completely still. There is no instruction for this. No memory, no instinct, no accumulated experience that tells you how to stand in front of a woman's hand when the woman is your mother, and you have no memory of what that means. I had nothing to draw from. I only knew that I wasn't going to move. That moving would have been wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, but felt with absolute certainty. The headache came. It came from the left, the way it always had. But larger this time, not the dull, familiar pressure, but something with force behind it. Something that felt structural, like a wall absorbing more weight than it was built for. I kept my eyes open. I kept my breathing even. I looked at the woman in front of me and let the pain do what it was going to do. She looked at me without hesitation, without the searching quality I might have expected, without uncertainty. She looked at me the way people look at things they have never stopped knowing, even when knowing them had no practical use, even when everything around them argued for giving it up. And then she said my name. Silas. Not a question. Not a test. Not a tentative offering held out to see if it would be accepted. A name spoken by someone who had been keeping it, turning it over, holding it intact, refusing to let it erode through 15 years of mornings in this room, and was now simply returning it to the person it belonged to. The wall broke. Not gradually. All of it at once, the way things break, when the pressure has been building from the inside, for longer than the structure was ever meant to hold. I felt it go, a physical sensation behind my left eye, a release that was also a rupture pain, and something that wasn't pain occupying the same moment. And then it was there, a drafting table covered in drawings, evening light coming through tall windows, the smell of coffee from another room, a boy's voice from down the hall, high-pitched, still young, saying something I couldn't hear clearly, but knew was addressed to me. Blueprints spread across a car hood at a construction site, the specific weight of a drafting pencil between two fingers. Then night. A site without finished railings on the northeast corner, a voice raised, a hand, the edge, then nothing. Then 15 years of nothing. Then a storm in Houston, a phone buzzing on a dash mount, and a long road that had led, without my understanding, It was leading anywhere to this room. My legs did not hold. I went down, not a fall, a descent, my knees finding the floor in the particular way a body moves when it has decided this is where it needs to be, and there's no point in arguing with it, and the floor was solid under me. I stayed there. Margaret came down with me, no hesitation. She lowered herself to the floor beside me, the way someone does when they've decided that wherever this person is, that's where they're going to be. Her hand stayed where it was against my face. Her eyes stayed on mine. I looked at her, and for the first time since I had woken up in a hospital with no name and no past, I knew who was looking back at me. Not a stranger reading my face for information, not Julian calculating what I needed next. Something older than either of those. Something that didn't require explanation or confirmation or proof. "Wife," I said. One word, spoken quietly without preparation. It had no performance in it, no weight it was trying to carry, no 15-year freight attached. It was just the word given back to the person it had always been for, in the only voice I had. She closed her eyes, opened them. Her hand didn't move from my face. She had known. I understood that in the same moment I understood everything else she had known he survived, which meant she had spent 15 years in this room waiting for a man she had no way of reaching. That was the part of it I was not ready to think about yet. But it was there. Behind us, I heard Julian, barely audible, barely there. Not words, just the sound of someone letting something go that they'd been holding for a very long time. None of us moved for a while. Eventually, the room settled. The light through the window shifted as the morning moved forward. Margaret's hand lowered slowly, and she sat back. Julian was in the chair by the door, looking at the floor. I was still on my knees, but the pain had gone completely, not receded, gone, leaving behind a silence so thorough it had its own texture. I stood up. I looked at Julian, who looked back at me. Something had changed in the way he was reading my face. I could see him adjusting, recognizing something new there that hadn't been present before, recalibrating the way people recalibrate when the situation they've been managing has fundamentally shifted. "I remember everything," I said. My voice was steady, quieter than usual, but steady, including the night it happened. Julian held my gaze. I turned toward the window. Through it, past the manicured grounds of Rosewood and the low western skyline, the upper floors of a building I had designed were just visible in the distance, catching the late morning light. "I know exactly what needs to be done," I said. 2 weeks is long enough to change the shape of a plan. Diana Cross's office occupied the 12th floor of a building in the Galleria district, the kind of address that communicated seriousness without loudness, which was, I would come to understand, very much in keeping with how Diana herself operated. The afternoon light came through floor-to-ceiling windows at a low November angle, laying long rectangles of gold across a desk that held exactly what needed to be on it, and nothing else. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, precise in movement, precise in speech, the kind of lawyer who had spent decades making sure every word she used was the one she meant. Julian had found her through a contact in the architecture world, someone who dealt with intellectual property disputes long enough to know which attorneys actually understood what was at stake in them. She'd taken the case after a single meeting without visible surprise at what she was being told, which told me something about either her experience or her composure, and possibly both. She opened the folder on her desk and turned it to face us. "September 2009, she said. 3 days before the incident at the construction site, a will was filed with a notary public, registered with the federal system in Houston, Harris County." She set a photocopied document on top of the folder, dense legal text signatures at the bottom, the notary seal visible even in reproduction. It was never revoked. It was never contested. It was never, as far as the record shows, even located by anyone with reason to look for it until now. I looked at the document. The signature at the bottom was mine. I knew it the way I knew the rhythm I tapped on steering wheels, the way I knew the angle of the upper setback on a building I'd designed, not from looking at it now, but from somewhere that had been waiting to be asked. Because you were never declared legally deceased, only listed as a missing person, the will was never triggered for probate. It has been waiting intact for 15 years. Under Texas law, that distinction matters. 70% of all assets and intellectual property holdings, Diana continued, including full copyright attribution for the Zenith Project and all derivative works to Julian Sterling. She paused. 30% to Vance Sterling contingent on non-interference with the company's creative direction. Another pause smaller. The contingency was never met. The will is fully enforceable. Julian turned to look at me. I'd been watching the document. I looked up. You knew, he said. Not an accusation. Something quieter than that. The particular tone of someone revising a long-held understanding. You knew he was capable of it. I didn't know what he'd do, I said. I knew what he wanted. I'd watched him want it for a long time. I looked back at the will. 3 days before something felt wrong in a way I couldn't name. The conversation we'd had that week, the way he'd started moving people around in the filings. I made the will the way you check the locks before a long trip. Not because you know something will happen, but because you understand the possibility exists. Julian was quiet for a moment. You were protecting me, he said. I didn't answer that directly. Some things don't need the confirmation said aloud to be true. Diana set 3 more documents alongside the will, arranged with the methodical precision of someone presenting a case she had already organized in her own mind. Dr. Hartwell's forensic analysis of the architectural drawings. Edward's notarized statement signed and witnessed covering everything he'd told me at Carver's, and a certified record from Rosewood facility, documenting the admission of one Eleanor Webb true identity, Margaret Sterling, under circumstances that constituted false imprisonment under Texas and federal law. This is sufficient, Diana said. She said it the way people say things that are true and don't require embellishment. For civil claims on the intellectual property and the estate, for criminal referral on the attempted homicide, the fraud, and the unlawful imprisonment, for everything. She folded her hands on the desk. The question is how you want to proceed. I looked out the window. Below and to the south, the Houston skyline ran along the horizon, the mid-rises of the Galleria, giving way to the taller cluster of downtown, and among them unmistakable at this distance, the particular vertical line of the zenith, catching the late afternoon light along its upper face. I'd looked at that building from every angle this city offered, from a moving car, from a sidewalk, from an apartment window, from a hospital I didn't remember. This was the first time I'd looked at it from a position where I knew exactly what it was and exactly what it meant. I want it done in public, I said. In front of everyone who needs to see it. I don't want a filing. I don't want a settlement negotiated in a room somewhere. I want the people who built careers on what was taken to be in the same room when it's returned. Diana considered me for a moment, not evaluating the legality, I thought, but the person making the request. Then she nodded. Sterling Group holds their 15-year anniversary gala in January, she said. Full board attendance, major press, industry partners from across the country. The event is scheduled for the 14th. She set her pen down parallel to the edge of the folder. It would be, strategically speaking, an effective venue. I turned from the window. Oh, then that's when, I said. We wrapped up the remaining details, what Diana needed, what she'd prepare, what Julian and I should and shouldn't do in the weeks between now and January. She was thorough without being slow, and we were done within the hour. In the elevator going down, Julian stood beside me. We didn't speak. There was nothing that needed saying, not because there wasn't anything left between us, but because what was there didn't require language right now. We'd gotten here through 15 years of one kind of silence and a few months of something entirely different, and this particular quiet standing side by side in a descending elevator had a different character from either of those. It was simply two people who had found their way to the same place standing in it together. The lobby doors opened onto the late Houston afternoon traffic, moving pedestrians crossing the ordinary city doing its ordinary things. To the south, just visible above the mid-rise line, the upper floors of the Zenith caught the last of the day's light. I looked at it for a moment. 2 months, I said. Not to Julian specifically, not to anyone in particular. Just a number placed into the air to mark the distance between now and what was coming. Then I turned up my collar against the November chill and we walked to the car. The Port District at 2 in the morning was the quietest Houston ever got. Not silent, a city this size doesn't do silence. Somewhere south, the container yards kept running. A ship horn sounded once far out toward the bay and didn't repeat. But the parking area off Clinton Drive was empty, and I'd pulled in without deciding to, the way the Lincoln sometimes went places on its own when I wasn't directing it anywhere particular. I left the engine off and sat. The dashboard had a crack in the upper left corner where the plastic had split in a summer heat wave and never been fixed. The upholstery held coffee in a way that no amount of airing out had ever fully addressed. The center console had the small orange pill bottle half full. Now the headaches mostly gone since November, as if whatever had been sealed behind that wall had taken the pressure with it when it finally broke. 15 years of one life written in the ordinary damage of a car. I didn't try to make sense of it. I just sat with it the way you sit with someone who's been with you a long time when there's nothing left that needs saying. Margaret was in a proper facility now under her own name. The court had moved faster than any of us expected. Diana's paperwork had been, as she put it without expression, difficult to argue against. I'd seen Margaret twice since then. We were learning how to be in the same room with everything between us and around us and despite us. It was slow. It was the right kind of slow. Julian had spent Christmas with her. He told me afterward the way he told me things, selecting what mattered, leaving the rest. She'd asked about me. He'd said I was all right. She'd said she knew. I didn't examine that too closely. Some things are better received than taken apart. I thought about Julian, about what it takes to search for something for 15 years without certainty that it exists, without a guarantee, without a signal, with only the decision to keep going as the only available instrument. Most people at some point look at the evidence and decide it's run out. He hadn't. I didn't know if that was faith or stubbornness or something else, and I'd stopped needing it to have a name. I didn't think about Vance. Not tonight. He would be there tomorrow with a microphone and a room full of cameras and everything he'd built on something that wasn't his. There was enough time for Vance tomorrow. Tonight, he didn't get any of this, the quiet, the cold, the particular January sky over the port that was clear enough to show a few stars if you looked long enough. My phone lit up. Julian. He confirmed, Julian said. Opening address, full stage, full press. A pause. He doesn't know. I looked up through the windshield at the cold sky. Good, I said. Honey, then he'll be the first one to see me walk in. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. The quiet came back. The distant hum of the container yards. The faint pull of salt water somewhere to the east. I'd always found the port settling for the same reason it had no interest in what any particular person was carrying. The ships moved, the cranes moved, the water moved. Everything else was interior. After a while, I reached forward and turned the key. The Lincoln came alive the way it always had. Low rumble first, then the idle settling into something steady and familiar. the faint vibration moving up through the seat and into my hands on the wheel. I didn't pull out of the parking space. I just sat with the engine running. It had kept me moving, this car. Through the years, I had no name for myself. Through the years, the headaches came bad enough that I should have stopped and didn't. Through every late shift and empty stretch of highway and fare that went nowhere interesting. It had been the one constant, not safe exactly, not comfortable, but present. Tomorrow I would walk into a room and say my name, the real one. Tonight I could still sit here engine running and be grateful for the years this car had carried me without once asking who I was. They had lasted long enough. That was enough. The convention center's main hall held 4,000 people when it was full, and on the morning of January 14th, it was full. I entered from the East Corridor at 9:52, 8 minutes into Vance's opening address. I'd timed it that way. Not so early that the room hadn't settled, not so late that the speech was ending. 8 minutes in, everyone is listening. 8 minutes in the room belongs to whoever is standing at the microphone. It was about to belong to someone else. Julian had handled the security arrangements 3 days prior, a conversation with the venue coordinator that I hadn't asked the details of and didn't need to. What I knew was that when I came through the east door in the dark suit he'd had waiting for me, nobody stopped me. The floor stretched out ahead, rows of chairs, 1,000 conversations suspended, while the man on the stage spoke into the silence he'd arranged for himself. I walked down the center aisle, not fast, not slow. The pace of a man who knows where he's going and has decided that arriving with urgency would give too much away. I kept my eyes forward level on the stage at the far end of the room. The chandeliers overhead threw light across the floor in long panels. Sterling Group signage ran the length of the side walls, the company name in letters 2 feet high. My company name. The people I passed registered me in sequence, a turn of the head, a whispered comment, a second look. I didn't acknowledge any of it. I'd spent 15 years being invisible on these streets, moving through spaces without being seen. One more walk through a room full of people was not the difficult part of today. I heard it before I saw it. Vance's voice, practiced fluent, the cadence of a man who had given versions of this speech many times, stopped. Mid-sentence. Half a beat no longer. But in a room this quiet, half a beat is audible to 4,000 people. The kind of pause that happens when something enters a person's field of vision that their brain needs an extra moment to process. I looked up at the stage then. He was looking at me. I held the look for 1 second. Then I kept walking. The stage stairs were 4 steps, stage right. I went up them without changing my pace. 2 men in event security jackets moved from the wings and stopped. One of them glanced toward the front row, received a nod I didn't see, but understood had come from Julian, and stepped back. Whatever Julian had arranged 3 days prior, it had held. I walked to the center of the stage and stopped at the microphone. Vance was 3 feet to my right, close enough that I could see the particular quality of stillness that had come over him, not the controlled stillness of a man managing a situation, but the stillness of a man whose systems have temporarily failed to produce an output. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked out at the room. 4,000 faces, every camera in the building turning toward the stage. "I apologize for the interruption," I said, "and for being late." I paused. 15 years late. I set the paper on the podium. Diana had prepared it, architectural bond, the right weight. I uncapped the drafting pen Julian had placed in my jacket pocket that morning, and I drew. The room was so quiet I could hear the pen moving. I didn't look up. I didn't think about the cameras or the audience or the man 3 feet away who had built half a decade's worth of power on the work I was recreating from the bottom of my own memory. I just drew the way I'd drawn in a motel room in late September with rain on the window, the way I'd drawn in an apartment on a sheet of white paper, with no explanation for how my hand knew where to go. The facade came first. The vertical rhythm. The setback at the 32nd floor. then the curtain wall detailing the corner glass treatment, and finally, in the last 20 seconds, the element that wasn't in any public filing, the interior structural notation that existed only in the working drawings and in whatever part of me had survived the fall and the years and the forgetting. I set the pen down. 90 seconds, I'd counted. Only one person in this room could have drawn that, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. And that person has a name. I looked at Vance. He looked back at me. And for the first time since I'd walked through the east door, I let myself really look at him, at the face I'd known before I knew anything, at the man who had built everything that surrounded us on the foundation of what he'd taken. I looked at him and waited for something. Anger, maybe, or the particular cold satisfaction that the movies suggest should accompany a moment like this. There was neither. What I felt was tired, deeply, specifically tired, the kind that doesn't come from a single night, but from 15 years of carrying something without knowing you were carrying it. And underneath the tiredness, something else, something lighter, something that had been trying to surface since the moment I walked through those doors. From the left wing, Edward Holt appeared. He crossed the stage at an unhurried pace, a sealed folder in both hands, and placed it on the podium beside my drawing. He didn't look at Vance. He looked at me once, and gave the smallest possible nod. Behind him, moving in from the floor at the base of the stage, two figures in dark jackets. Federal identification at their belts. They didn't hurry either. The room had gone so still I could hear the ventilation system. Vance looked from me to Edward, to the two agents, to Julian, who was sitting in the front row with his hands folded in his lap, looking up at the stage with an expression of absolute, deliberate calm. Vance did not speak. There was by then nothing useful left to say. I watched the agents reach the stage. I watched them approach. I watched Vance turn finally and go with them. Not because he had a choice, but because the moment when choices had existed had passed some time ago, and what remained now was only the accounting. The hall stayed silent for 3 full seconds after they walked him down the stage stairs. Then it came apart. The sound rose all at once. 4,000 people, cameras, clicking voices overlapping the particular pressure wave of a large room in motion. I stood at the podium and let it happen around me. I looked at the drawing on the lectern. I looked out at the room. I looked up briefly at the ceiling of the hall, the particular geometry of the roof trusses, the way the light fell through the clear-story windows above. I'd designed this building too. The thought arrived without drama, without ceremony. Just a fact, quietly returning to where it had always belonged. Julian came up the stage stairs. He crossed to where I was standing and stopped beside me. He didn't say anything. He looked out at the room the way I was looking at it, not performing the moment, not measuring it, just standing in it. He put his hand on my shoulder briefly, then let it drop. That was enough. Sometimes that is all a person needs, someone standing beside them when the long thing finally ends. Not words, not explanation. Just presence, which is the oldest form of any of it. I stood on the stage and breathed. 6 months is long enough to learn what a city looks like when you're no longer afraid of it. Houston in July runs hot and gold before 8 in the morning. I drove the Lincoln through Midtown with the windows down, and the streets looked the same as they always had, and entirely different. The way familiar things do when the person looking at them has changed. Vance was convicted in May. 32 years, attempted murder, aggravated fraud, unlawful imprisonment. No parole eligibility for the first 20. The jury took 11 hours. I wasn't in the courtroom. Diana had recommended against it, and she was right, as she generally was. Julian called me afterward with 3 sentences, and then we talked about something else. There wasn't much more to say about Vance. There hadn't been really since January. My office was on the 2nd floor of a converted building on Shepherd Drive. 2 rooms, 1 for drafting, 1 for the meetings that were starting to come in as word moved through the city's architecture community that Silas Sterling was practicing again. The sign on the door had taken 3 weeks to feel like mine. It did now. On the main drafting table, weighted at the corners, was a complete set of working drawings for the Zenith, fully notated, legally certified, released from the Sterling Group archives by court order in March. In the lower right corner of every sheet in the notation block, design Silas Sterling, AIA. The patents had been formally reassigned in March, following USPTO review of Diana's petition for correction of inventorship. That process, too, was now part of the record. Not on the building. The building would keep the name it had been given. That was fine. The record was what mattered, and the record was now correct. Margaret came most mornings. She'd moved into an apartment 3 blocks from Julian's in February, outpatient, a nurse 3 times a week. She was better than she'd been, which meant something different in July than it had in January. She walked on her own. She asked Julian to take her to see the bayou last week. When she came to the office, we sat together near the window and didn't say much. I made coffee and set a cup near her and went back to the drawings, and the quiet between us was the full kind, not the empty kind. 15 years of absence can't be reconstructed in conversation. We'd stopped trying to reconstruct it and started simply adding to what came after. Julian came on Thursdays. We hadn't discussed the arrangement, it had just settled into place the way some things do when nobody is forcing them. He'd bring something from the bakery on Westheimer, and we'd sit with coffee and talk about whatever was in front of us. His work. The company which he was running with a steadiness that surprised no one who'd been watching. Sometimes nothing in particular. We were learning each other slowly and imperfectly, and I wouldn't have changed any of it. On a Tuesday in late July, I drove north to Acres' home. My father's grave was a plain granite marker. I set the flowers down, stood for a while in the summer heat, then sat on the bench nearby and talked. Not because I was certain he could hear it. I'm not built for that kind of faith. But there were things that needed to be said out loud, and he was the right direction to say them. I told him about the years, about what had come back and what hadn't, and what I'd found in the space between. About Julian. About Margaret sitting by windows again. I stayed until the heat got serious. Then I drove back south. I came down Allen Parkway and turned onto Smith, and the tower was there the way it always was. I pulled to the curb and got out. I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at it. The full 62 floors in the July sun. The vertical rhythm. The setback at 32. The corner glass treatment that had come from an afternoon of thinking out loud on paper in a room that no longer existed. I looked at all of it and felt nothing I needed to manage, no pain behind the eye, no hollow pull, no nausea rising. Just a man on a sidewalk looking at something he had made in a city that had kept it standing while he was away. The name above the lobby door would not change. That was fine. I had the drawings. I had the record. I had a sign on a door 2 miles from here. I got back in the Lincoln and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, a man looked back at me. He had a name, had a son who came on Thursdays, had a wife learning what mornings could be again, had work on a table waiting to be finished, had a city he'd driven for 15 years without knowing it had always, in some quiet way, been his. I nodded once at the mirror. Not for anyone watching, just an acknowledgement between me and the fact of things. Then I pulled into traffic. No destination, no fare, no dispatch call waiting. Just Houston in July with the windows down and a long morning ahead and nowhere I needed to be except exactly where I already was. That was new. That was enough. 15 years. That's how long it took me to find my way back to my own name. This grandpa story didn't begin the night I walked into that gala. It began the night I decided that 15 years of silence had been enough, that the truth, however buried, was still mine to claim. I believe God doesn't waste a man's pain. Those years behind the wheel weren't lost. They were the long way around to the only door that mattered. but I won't pretend I took that road well. I ran from what I didn't understand. I chose invisibility over answers, silence over the kind of family justice that my son had been fighting for alone for 15 years without ever giving up. Don't be like me. If someone in your life is waiting, if there is a door you've been too afraid to open, open it now. The people on the other side may have been there longer than you know. My honest belief, no empire built on stolen ground ever truly stands. And family justice isn't only something courts deliver. Sometimes it's a son who refuses to stop looking. Sometimes it's a father who finally chooses to be found. This grandpa story is proof that truth outlasts silence always. If this grandpa story stayed with you, if you believe that family justice is worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes, leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want to stay for what comes next, you already know what to do. Thank you for being here until the very last word. That means everything. A gentle note, the stories ahead contain fictional elements built for the purpose of reflection and inspiration. If that is not the journey you are looking for, no hard feelings, find the story that speaks to you. But if you are staying, welcome. There is more to tell.